I'm Jay Farrakane. I run a studio called Angry Bovine. I've been doing Caffeinated now for, well, with the pandemic included, probably 8 years. And my ultimate goal, Marc just said, what's your goal with this? And I actually have to think about sometimes, why do I do what I do? But it's mainly just to create a touch point for the creative community to come together on a regular basis. And it's actually awesome. Kevin Menzie is here, and he's kind of, if you would ask me the genesis of why I did what I did, because when I first moved to Colorado, I would go to his meetups, and it was such a rad thing that it made me want to do that myself. So welcome, Kevin. I haven't seen you in a long time.
Oh, Kevin Menzie.
Big thanks to all our sponsors that make this happen. Josh, you've been the homie here for coffee for years. Thank you, Coffee Ride. Also, Rowdy Mermaid jumping in this week with us, helping us out on beverages. I hope you guys got to taste some of that. Thank you, Jamba. Buck Ross for all the awesome video stuff that they do for us. It's great. If you ever miss a show, you can always check us out on YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, MySpace. I don't think we're on MySpace. But anyway, we're everywhere. Just Google it, and you can catch our old shows. And also, thanks to Snappy Little Numbers, we actually have our own non-hijacked theme song on our videos now, which is kind of nice because I don't have to have my lawyer talk to people anymore. And then we're also here at CMCI Studio. So CMCI Studio is a grad school that's kind of creating the next level of like creatives and very well-rounded technology, strategy, design, and then product. So if you're interested, David Sladen, the dean, is here. So find him, grab him, say what's up. So is Parisa, our last month's guest. And they can fill you in if you want to know a little bit more about that program, but they give us a place to call home. So thank you very much, you guys. So today we're lucky to have business poet and certified brand architect, Marc Gutman. Hi, Marc.
Hi.
How are you?
Great.
Good.
So happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm very happy, and I was super excited about this talk because I really do think of you as a dear friend, and we have been, I think it's safe to say, frequent, longtime collaborators now.
Safe, very safe to say.
It's been going on for a while. And I do, and we'll get into this a little bit because the word storyteller gets thrown around kind of lightly these days. But I think you are a true storyteller, and it's even in your company name, Wildstory. If you guys want to learn more about Marc's company, check out wildstory.com. And this talk will probably take a few twists and turns. Like every phone call or meeting we do, it usually starts out with some intention and then just goes completely off the rails. But I bet you there'll be one of the things you'll really enjoy about this talk, or at least notice about Marc, is that he is extremely sincere and he really cares about the work that he's doing. So we're gonna get rolling.
Well, thank you.
I wanted to kind of start us out. I always like to, me and you were having a discussion about what's really missing in stories these days. And it doesn't have a beginning, a middle, and an end. God damn you kids, you're not listening. So I'm going to go to the start at the beginning. And just, how did you get started in brand and strategy when you started out reviewing scripts for Oliver Stone?
Yeah.
I mean, it seems like somewhat a step away from one another.
Yeah. No, it's a winding, twisty road. But, I kind of really think back to how it all started is like, I connected with I'm a Gen Xer, right?
Yeah.
And so I didn't have parents that coddled and they were great, but they weren't always like, how you feeling, and so I really connected with my dad around movies and and to see him, he was kind of like a buttoned up guy and pretty straight and he would laugh hilariously and he would just cackle at the top of his lungs. I'm like, wow. My kind of serious dad, if stories make him feel like this, I want to do that. So I went out, and as you mentioned, I went out to the film business, and I got lucky. I ended up working with Oliver Stone as his story editor. It is now defunct production company called Illusion Entertainment, but worked on a ton of movies, and it was amazing, and it was great, and learned all about storytelling. I went on to work at Warner Brothers and worked on a movie you guys might have heard of called Osmosis Jones, which was an animation live action movie where they would put the movie up on the wall for a year. And we'd stop by and be like, well, this isn't quite working, and we'd massage it, we noodle it, and for better or worse, really kind of dissect this movie. But it just felt at a certain point like I hadn't seen a lot of the world. I wasn't sure what I wanted to say. And so I came here, to take a sabbatical and never left. But the thing that was super cool at that time was there was this whole startup community. And I was like, holy crap, like these people are way cooler than like, movie stars and people in the movie business are like solving problems or doing things. And so
it was also really open, I think, at that time, too. It felt like people were just connecting people to one another, and you're like, shit's gonna happen.
Yeah, and I was at that time in my life, I was younger, obviously, and there was just a lot of energy. A lot of really smart people that I'm friends with today have now gone on, like you probably recognize their names all over Boulder, started and sold companies and done really cool stuff. But I didn't know it at the time. They were just everyone we were going having beers with the old Oasis, And so I started a tech company based on audio conferencing technology. And I always say I wasn't the best entrepreneur, but I kind of like always reverted naturally back to branding, marketing, telling that story, trying to make it seem, I always would go into these meetings with other creatives like, I want to make like a rock and roll audio conferencing company. And they're like, what? like this isn't like a rock and roll. But we did, and we did that, and we sold that business. And throughout the whole time, I was like, I felt like I couldn't escape telling stories, and I wasn't really sure how that was going to work, because during that time with the conferencing company, right, like people would be like, hey Mark, you worked in the movie business, can you help us tell our story? And I was like, yes, let's do it.
We get amped about it.
Yeah, and we'd engage, and it was just like a flaming disaster. Like every single one.
Like, what defines a disaster though?
Well, I wasn't happy, they weren't happy, okay. I don't think they got what they wanted. And I think it's really because this word story is really kind of weird, right? There's a new friend of mine now. His name's Marc Pollard. He's out of New York City. He talks a lot about words and strategy. And before he was my friend, I was a fan. That's how I reached out to him. And he talks about this concept of like monogamous words, right? And your words need to be monogamous. They need to have individual meaning. Story does not have that, right? It's very polygamous, right? It means a lot of things to a lot of different people. It could be your keynote, it could be your Instagram, it could be what we're doing here, right? And people just kind of throw that. Could be a Ferris wheel, right? We've talked about that.
Roller coaster.
Roller coaster, yeah. And so it just didn't end well. And I was trying to find out how to give this more of a business context, how to put storytelling into terms that I could add value and people would pay for. And so actually Wildstory started as a PR firm, and that didn't go well either. And there's different reasons for that, but I think what most people were telling me is they wanted to be on the cover of Forbes or CNN or something like that. What I learned, what I believe they were telling me is, hey, I want to know our story. I want to know what makes us special. Why do we stand out? Why do we connect with our customer? Like, what difference are we making? How can I tell our employees and make our employees come to work and feel good about what they're doing in their place in all this? And so that was the genesis of it. And I started to look back and be like, well, this is kind of like, this is branding. This is brand strategy. And it really started to marry the things that I learned.
Did someone point that out to you at some point, or were you like, in the construct of building a business, obviously you're around marketers and people are probably asking you like these like platform questions, right? Like, can you help us with our brand? Like, that's a thing that someone walks up to you and says, right? And you're like, oh, do I know what to insert into that? Did it all make sense, or was it?
No, not at all. I was like, no, I can't help you with your brand. I'm not a branding guy. Like, I don't know anything about this. I didn't work at an agency. I didn't come from that. It was a lot of sort of self-discovery, a lot of reflection. Like when I teach storytelling workshops, right? I talk about like finding your origin story, your backstory is it's a process of discovery, right? We're not creating, and it's just kind of going back. We look backwards. And there was a lot of that, a lot of kind of figuring out, hey, like, what value can I bring? Where can I make some money? Where, what words are people using, right? Because again, that story word, I kept talking this is kind of funny, like I'd be talking for 10 years about storytelling and everyone's like confused and don't know what I do. All of a sudden, like the last 2 years, everyone's like, can you teach storytelling workshops? Because all this personal branding stuff actually has like a lot of application for that and like help us find my own individual story. But like for a long time, it was just like, it was really confusing.
Well, even in finding your own story, I think what's really interesting is you kind of eat your own dog food, if that, if you know what I mean when I say that. And one of the things that I got to work on with you was I helped you make your own brand. And this isn't about my portfolio or anything like that, but truly as a designer, if you were asking me some of the things that I really, really love working on, and it's the stuff that means stuff to the company. A logo is one thing, but laying out things like a manifesto and the dedication that went into this and the meaning behind it all, and we're going to go in here, but like there was a layering that you let me do with your brand, and it was kind of a work in progress feel. all that kind of stuff. But you, in your own manifesto, and your company does have this belief on, it's like what happens in the after, the après kind of thing, which I've always loved. And that for you as an outdoors person, you go rip big turns on a, snowboarding day, and then it is the beers that you have that talk about stuff. But I think there's even something in that after effect of when you finish a project and there's that glow of like, fuck, that felt super good, right? But I want to talk about the manifesto that you laid out here, mainly for the point of back to your dad, is that the genesis at the breakfast table, and the conversation you had with the dad about loving what you do. And how'd that go down? I remember you were like, I'm sitting there one day eating Cheerios, and your dad's like, probably like my dad. Except my dad was in camouflage.
My dad's not. He was a lawyer. He was kind of straight. He wore 3-piece suits, and he worked really hard. I grew up in Detroit, and so you can imagine. Usually, when you wake up in Detroit, it's gray and cold, and there's not much going on. But that was the time that I'd get to hang out with my dad because he'd leave by like 6:30 or whatever. So the story that we shared was I was sitting there with him, and we would eat Honey Nut Cheerios together, and I just asked him straight up. I was like, Dad, do you love your job? And he just kind of looked at me and he was like, Mark, they wouldn't call it work if it was supposed to be fun. And just kind of went back to his Cheerios, and I was like,
have a good day.
Yeah, and I was like, at 9 years old, right? It was just like, and I was like, that's not going to be me, right? Like, I'm not doing that. And so it's really been this lifelong quest to find work that I love. I mean, I think that's part of coming to Colorado, right? Like, I was in LA, and no offense to anyone's from LA or lives there, but like, I was like, I don't think I want to live here my whole life, right? And I came here, and that's been long a unofficial principle of mine. I do it like organically. I don't think about it. It's like, go to where you want to be. Go to where like it's important to you. Whether that's why I went out to LA. I didn't have any contacts. I grew up in Detroit. Like I could have worked in the auto industry, but the film industry was not high on the list of any contacts. And just get there. My first job wasn't with Oliver Stone. It was driving film around for a Epcot film for Disney, which actually turned out to be really cool. It was like 3 panels, 70 millimeter. If you're a film geek, it was like super neat. And Ellen, first day at work, I get there, and they're like, oh, the talent's coming in, and I sit down, and it's like literally Ellen DeGeneres, and we sit on a carpet just like this, like 6 of us, and I'm like, what is going on, right? My first job.
Act like you know what you're doing.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Well, and that got me, but driving film around, I had like all these huge cans of film to carry, and that got me on the lot, which then allowed me, and there was a lot of downtime because you're waiting for the film to bring. I'd just go walk around, and I'd like pop my head into different bungalows and be like, hey, I'm Mark, And now I think back, I'm like, gee, I can't believe I didn't like get tackled or like, security didn't usher me out.
There was no security back
then. Right. And then literally like in a movie, I had befriended this like producer who worked at theme parks, and he's like, call this guy, and that turned out to be that job. So, but that took some time, and that was about getting to a place that I wanted, a community where I wanted to be, and much like what brought me to Colorado was like getting to Boulder.
It's so funny because someone was giving me shit the other night when we did our talk that generally the thing that comes up in this talk is either skateboarding or punk rock, and that probably will still come up. But one of the things that really comes up in all of everyone's "How did you get here?" is I just put myself there, and I think that's a lot of things that people forget to do, right? Like, using punk rock as the analogy, you create the scene you want to be in, right? You don't wait for somebody to bring it to you. And I think that trait is very interesting. And, back to like working where you love, the creative industry is really funny because I think it's not an industry you get into unless you do really love it. And I'm going to put whether you see what you do as a creative part of the creative industry, right? Brand building, strategy.
Sure. Yeah, for sure.
Sometimes people see that and they're like, oh, it's only visuals or whatever. I think even coding is creative, but a lot of times coders will tell me I'm full of it too. But the creative industry is a funny one because you really can't do it if you don't love it. And even the illustrations, you had 10 years of like pissed off people, you unhappy, think people not getting what they expected or wanted, but that's all a learning process along the way. Mm-hmm. And then this was the thing that I thought was so interesting to me is that you realized at some point that you have to fall in love with the brand and the people you're working with and the product. Now, to what degree that might be, I know that's probably a loose word, but like expand on that. To do a really good job, you need to love the thing you're working on.
Yeah, and that's personal. I don't believe that everyone has to feel that way. Like, first of all,
but that's your success.
Yeah, that's I really, and I've come to that I really do believe that my job is to fall in love, find a way to fall in love with the brand, with the client, and then write a love story to the world, right? Like, and that love story can take on a lot of, and so the other people fall in love. I mean, and that's what's really exciting. I have this friend who's been kind of bumpy in relationships, and his name's Isaac. He's like, Marc, I just love new love, and it's like, and I'm like, and that's kind of how I feel. Like, I love the opportunity to meet new brands, new businesses, and it's really cool to hear someone's dream, hear someone's perspective, hear their point of view of how they want to bring a business to life, and then try to find a way to make that, connect from a human perspective, but also like to sell stuff. Right? Like, I mean, I do say this often, like, purpose of what I do in the brand is to help you sell more things, right? Or to influence or to make you do things. I mean, we're not here to, like, it isn't art, and we talk about this a lot, right? It does have utility, it does have purpose. Now, it's creative, and there is, I do believe, what I do is this a little bit of a blend between art and science, and Jay and I were talking about this, and it's the first time I talked about this. I feel like a little, like, kind of,
we're trying it out. It's a safe place.
I don't know if I feel arrogant or what, but a lot of times I feel that I'm a medium, and then I'm trying to channel what resonates, what I can find in it, and sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's not, and I'm out there like with my divining rods, right, in this landscape of what makes a business interesting and cool, and then it's just kind of like.
Well, and I loved that when you said that medium thing, because I think there are multiple types of designers, and if I categorize myself, I think of myself as a catalytic designer. I need parts to be put in, and then I stick it in beakers. But the medium concept was very interesting to me, because I do think that there's a level of design often gets into this, and even brand building. Like, if you walked into a CEO's office and said, I feel like this is what your brand should be, that's a hard thing to sell. That's empathy. That's very subjective, right?
Yeah.
But if you show them a stat or a chart that says, this is what we believe your brand should be through all this research, and then all of a sudden it's objective, right? In some way. And that's why I think design, we had this talk, right?
Yeah.
That designers a lot of times try and shroud themselves, creators try and shroud themselves in objectivity because of the vulnerability of saying, look, man, I'm in love with this, and this is what I think it should be. For a long time, that's been kind of a slippery slope for two things. One, do you know if it'll really work? But also, it exposes you to them going, we hate that idea, and then your feelings are hurt, and everyone goes home sad, right?
Totally.
And so, like, I think the medium thing is really an interesting concept, because then it puts you in this position of, you are hiring me to filter this through my experiences and my beliefs. And that's a super interesting thing, because then, fuck you, AI, you can't do that. Right?
Hopefully.
So I love that. That's where I went with it. So that was exciting to me.
Yeah, no, and it's great, and it's informed belief, right?
Right.
I do, it's not just, and I think earlier in doing this, before Mad Men came out, I had a little bit of that Don Draper, where I'd like go for a walk and like, ha-ha!
Yeah.
And then I'd come back to the client and be like, ta-da! And they would be like, huh? Right? Like, and they'd be like, well, okay. And they'd be like, that's cool. Like, how'd you get there? I'd be like, I don't know.
Yeah. But still, I think that is the part, right? That where this subjective kind of brand development gets in dangerous waters. But now I believe in the medium setting, in my experiences, we believe you're coming at it from such a more empathy standpoint. It is not unfounded in any way. Yeah. I just think it's a new potential, like, defense platform. It's super interesting to me.
I like that.
I'm stealing it from you.
Let's do that. We're the empathetic creatives.
Yes. Well, but empathy is always talked about in more in the sense of, I'm not designing for myself, and I tell that to designers all the time. I'm like, you aren't designing, especially product design, and like using an iPhone or something like that, right? Like, give that app that you know inside and out from however you ended up designing it, and then put it in the hands of an 80-year-old. It's totally a different experience, right? But you may know how to use it, but that's where empathy gets kind of like weird, right? Like, and how do you start to make sure that it proves out?
Well, maybe. And just on that real quick, Jay, maybe we're coming full circle, right? There was the dawn in the era of the Ogilvies, of the Wolf Owens, right? It was always the person, right? Then everyone gets away from that. Like, we don't want to do that. It's like, Wildstory, Angry Bovine. It's all like, we name our company. We don't want to be the face. That's scary.
The work isn't about us.
Yeah, it's not about us.
Yeah.
But maybe now we're coming back with, where things are headed. Like, it is about us, and it's like, we're back going to enter that era of, it's the Marc Gutman agency.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah.
But it is an interesting thing to think about, because, when you work you're fortunate enough to have worked in brands and areas that you love. Like, I put up a couple of things that actually I didn't. You've worked on lots of stuff, from the RV industry to trail and mountain bike stuff to helping guys get Kickstarters like really well funded, things like that. And it's all over the map, but I would always step back that like at their core root, they're rad. It's not like I'm trying to do a rock and roll conference company, right? And we work in a lot of like kind of, I feel like at least me, I do work on a lot of unsexy, untangible stuff, but it doesn't mean you can't really believe in it. And it doesn't mean that it has to be boring too, right? And so like when you get involved with something, do you ever find it hard to separate yourself from like, this is how I would use it? Back to this point of objectivity and subjectivity, like, you know, your experience when you worked with like Thor, right? They make Airstream and Jayco and all this stuff. I mean, are you an avid like RVer?
No, I grew up RVing like, with my folks. I have some connection. You know, avid, younger in my days, avid backpacker, camper, stuff like that. But actually, no.
Right.
I'm a hotel kind of guy. I like to go out and get sweaty and then take a nice shower. But it's interesting. Like it really is an evolution. I mean, you know, I think there's common, you know, advice out there. Hey, you should go where you want, things like that. Outdoor industry, just being here, obviously, is kind of my network. Everyone we know. But so I always have just taken it in through my perspective. What I think is cool about the brand, what I think will resonate. That's not always exactly what I'm into. I can see outside of that a little bit. But also, like, I've had some interesting things happen where over the pandemic, as you might imagine, some of the outdoor industry like didn't do well, right? Some of it did awesome. Those weren't my clients. I had all the clients that like cratered. I had like one of the largest climbing gym companies in the world at this point, and no one wanted to touch a rock and put their face next to a rock during a pandemic. Things weren't good. And so what I found is I started taking on, sort of not telling anybody, I was like, I'm not telling anyone, like some like fintech and tech companies and things like that. I was like, yeah, I'll do it, you know, against my principles or whatever. I ended up loving it, right? Like it was so cool and it was so great, and they turned out to be great clients, and I'm doing more of it. And if there's tech that kind of fuses between lifestyle and outdoors, all the better. Had the opportunity to do that with like a textile company and stuff like that was doing some activewear, but like I think it's great. And so that's really where I come back to this idea of it's my job just to like kind of fall in love, and at least that crush begins in the pre-sale process, right? If I'm not gonna like put a round peg in a square hole if I'm like, I don't like this, or it doesn't go with my values, probably not a good client. But in that pre-sales, opportunity, if I'm like, like there's something here, like there's like a little bit of a spark, then I can make it work.
Even in that notion of, not to beat it over the head, but like the idea of sometimes working in industries that you are a little bit outside of. Like I know when I worked in bike, sometimes I was extra disappointed when I knew the thing that would work wasn't the one that was chosen.
Yeah.
But when you're working on things like automation software, there's some dude out there that needs that. I want to know why he needs it, and then get excited about that so I can help him make that connection, right? Cool. But I do think there is a little bit of a luxury that bringing those outside things that you are genuinely interested in, and that's why I've always said, as I do a lot of B2B branding that feels like consumer. And I think that's a very common practice these days, but when I first started it, I would try and make software companies look like a skate company. Not to the degree of like, but there would be things that I would sneak in there, And so, when you said that, I started working on some fintech, there's excitement about that, right? Like you are going to be able to apply the things again still that you're falling in love with, and and sometimes it's even more refreshing to see them in these new venues too, right? Like, I took this practice that I use in the ski industry, and we applied it to fintech. Like that's exciting. Like it's kind of a fun mashup. Do you look at it in like that parts kind of world? Like how do I apply that kind of, these approaches that I do for, say, more exciting companies, and you stick it into, someone that may be less exciting to
Yeah, totally. And I think that like there's always something to be said for like having domain expertise, right? Yep. So like you go in, all you do is work with fintech and blah, blah, blah. It's really, and that can work. But I've also had great success coming in like a complete idiot, right? And knowing nothing about the industry. And clients are sometimes scared about that. Like, have you done anything? No, I haven't. But like, that's kind of like what you want, someone to come with fresh eyes and be able, like, one of the clients I'm super stoked about right now I'm working with is a quantum computing company here in town. This guy doesn't know anything about quantum computing, right? And it's been tough, but it's like that process has always been like, well, how do I explain that in terms like at a cocktail party or at the dinner table, and like literally people are like, oh, tell me, what is quantum? I tell them I'm working, and I try to tell them, I'm like, okay, I'll go back, right? Because it wasn't like, it was really, really hard. And so, things like that I think are really amazing. I think we always bring our experience, like I love the theater, and I was working with this fintech company, I was struggling on a positioning, and I don't know what brought it together, but the song from Hamilton, the one where he's, in the room where it happens, right?
Yeah.
And I use that as the inspiration for basically like, we're going to bring you into the room where it happens for this fintech company. And that was just bringing an outside perspective, that had nothing to do with it, right? And I imagine that if they had had someone that had done 20 fintech companies, you would have seen one that looked a lot like everything else.
And that is like, and back to the types of creatives, like the Ogilvies and that stuff, when those guys were working, like we're tobacco or we're auto or whatever, and that's more advertising stuff, but those guys were the ones you went to. And I had the opportunity to work in auto, and I hadn't worked in auto, and it was really funny to try and convince the client to do stuff that not everybody else was doing. And it was a very bizarre process, because I walked in as like, is this an open canvas and you told us you want to make a mark? Why would you want to try and be like everything else that's happening? But that client saw it as, there was these compulsory checkpoints because we are in X industry, we have to do these things. And I'm like, it was so counter to me, and it like threw me on my heels big time. And I was like, so what did we end up doing? And anyway, it all ended up working out, but it was a struggle to get them to like move off of what was familiar.
Yeah, well, it's bizarre, right? Like,
they were scared.
We all say we want to be different. Like, I think if you ask any single brand, business person, like, I want to be different, but I kind of want to be like safe and the same, right?
Well,
and our brains are hardwired to like find safety in the familiarity. But so it's always that challenge, and I think it really, I tip the hat to anybody. I've been a tech business owner. I'm a business owner now. It's scary to be different, right? Like I can say I want to be different. I can tell the brand that they should be different. But like when you put your money where your mouth is, when you take that gamble, that's like huge. And so I just tip my hat to any brand that does it, and it works, right? Like when you see it work, it works. Like we're like the brand Liquid Death. They're just unapologetically who they are, selling water. But that's not like easy to do. And the way they do it, like, and they take a lot of flack, they take a lot of criticism, and they kind of just keep going.
Did you see their new campaign with the guy from Blink-182?
The enema?
Yeah. Did you order one?
No, okay, it was. I thought about it, but it was like $182. It was $182. It's a
very expensive enema
for Blink-182. But
well, speaking of things that doing, we scare clients sometimes. We scare ourselves, I think, a lot of times in what we're doing. And I don't think it's uncommon in the design industry or any creative world to have some anxiety or nervous energy around the things we do every day. Mm-hmm. Presenting, you mentioned like, man, I come up and do this kind of thing all day long, but like getting up and doing like a keynote or something. But the thing that fascinates me about you, and I don't know if you can Google this, but like you do have a knack of doing things that surprise me. Like, hey, I did this super long ass run. I'm running by your house. I'm on my AirPods. I'm like, Mark, if you're running, don't call me. Like, just go do your run, and then we'll talk afterwards. Maybe have a beer or something. But like, snowboarding, Iceland. Where were you? Just Iceland.
Just in Iceland. Yeah.
Just in Iceland. That's okay. That's fine. But the thing that is so fascinating to me, you did stand up. You like literally put yourself on a path. It's one thing to say, man, maybe I should do stand up, but then you went and did a set. Like,
I did.
How terrifying. What's
like,
the training
on a
like
scale of 1 to 10, probably 25. So yeah, I mean, towards the end of my career in the movie business, I was writing punch up for feature films, which it doesn't really exist anymore. But if you can get that work, it's amazing. They're like, hey, we're going into
comedians do still do it.
Yeah,
I was listening to a podcast. The guy was talking about doing it.
They're like, we're going into production in like 2 weeks. Make this funnier. You can't change anything. You're like, sweet. You're like, right? Like, 'cause you got this box, and like they use 2 jokes and whatever. So, and we could talk about that maybe after. But anyways, so I wanted to tell some jokes, and try to do it. And it was always something I wanted to do. And I always see stand up. I'm like, I could do that. I could do that.
But was it a manifestation of, was the want to do it? Because like, it's fairly common at least in advertising. I knew a ton of dudes that did stand up or played music, but it all came back to like improv. And like that fast idea generation, getting out of your comfort zone, is that was that part of like?
I think it was just challenge. It was something I wanted to do. I wanted to see if I could do it. You know,
set's funny, by the way.
Thank you. I hired a stand-up comic to kind of coach me through it. We did the set at Caroline's on Broadway, which unfortunately just closed this past year, but it was an amazing experience. But the night before, like we had a run through, I had a total panic attack. Totally freaked out. My wife Lindsay's here, and she'll attest. Like I was a basket case, and I think much like when you have a project you really care about or work you really care about, like that was like my truth, right? Like that's me coming up and saying, this isn't like a keynote saying like, here's the 3 things you need to do in your brand and blah, blah, blah. Like it's really like, I think this is funny. I actually think this is like kind of like thought provoking. I want you to think about this. Like I want you, and I got to remember it, right? And so I have this thing like when I have script, I'm not very good. I can write scripts, but like all my creativity comes through my fingers, you know, and to the page. Like to remember lines is like really, really hard for me, and I get hamstrung, and I'm like, oh crap, like I missed that transition or whatever, right? And then everything just spirals out of control, and so that was just really terrifying. But it went great, and I don't know if you've ever seen, you know, the old stand-up comedian hack or trick is you put your set list kind of on an index card, you put it on the stool, so every time they go grab a drink of water, they're not thirsty. They don't remember where they are in their set. So they're walking over and they're like, oh yeah, all right, I'm gonna tell that joke about Jay or whatever, you know? And so I did that, and you know, two big learnings from that were 2 things. As I was training, the stand-up comedian was like, hey, like through this process, we're gonna be making a lot of choices, but they're just choices. You know, and that's kind of like really, you know, applies to a lot of the creative work we do. There is no one way. When I talk about being a medium, there is no one X marks the spot. There's a lot of paths we can go. And the other thing is like when doing that talk, it was just like, all right, know how you're getting in, know how you're getting out. Everything else you kind of just fill in between. And I use that all the time too. Like if I'm speaking in front of people, I'm like, so like as to not like cloud up my head and stuff like that, because I get super nervous and anxious and stuff. Not like this for some reason, but
you're doing fine.
Yeah, but no, this is great.
Well, but it is an interesting thing to think about when you get up and you do something like a comedy routine. I think some of the best comedy is literally comedy that gets you to think, right? And then you have to make those leaps of, not only is it like surface level funny, right, which is like slapstick kind of stuff, or you know, potty humor and that, but when you have to really like unpack it, and that's when they always say like. Someone once described me as the designer's designer, which I think is full of shit, but when you say that about a comedian, it usually means that the comedian isn't funny to normal humans, right? Like it's only other, because like the comedian is looking at it as like from the craft standpoint. It's like it's like a carpenter walking into a house and looking at framing or something. They're like, you know, they don't care that the wall's standing up. They're like, why did that guy use those nails?
Yeah. Well, much like a story like that we're all familiar with, like maybe the original Star Wars, right? Like kind of you have to build that relationship before you can jump to the 5th Star Wars, right? And then we have a lot of latitude. Much like a comedian, like, you know, the other big learning was like, they told me that there's jokes you got to tell so you can tell the jokes you want to tell, right? And I really apply that a lot to like, you know, client work. Like you got to introduce yourself. You can't just come right out and be like, with the big stuff, right?
Yeah.
You got to kind of like work it. And then if maybe you work with a client again and referral basis or something, like, right, you have latitude. You don't have to restart that, but you have to kind of work there. You have to get there.
Well, and I think that's the big thing that was really interesting, because I've seen you speak enough. And then, I mean, you do things at speaking events like major corporations like Lilly and stuff like that too, right?
Yeah.
And then you'll do smaller nonprofit kind of stuff and things like that. But it is an interesting construct, because like I think the skills that you taught yourself along the way, whether you have them all along or not, and something like a comedic routine just gives you the ability to really like get certified in some weird way, which is kind of fascinating about you too, because I'll call you every once in a while. I'm like, what are you up to? And you're like, oh, I'm doing this, I'm taking this course on something. And then, you know, like I always joke, I'm the last one to ever want a license to do what I'm already doing.
Yeah.
Like, same thing like this talk show. Like no one's going to tell me like, hey, you should go and join some other outfit and do this through them. And that's happened actually. But to me, it was really interesting that, you know, you make yourself, you're already kind of doing what you're doing, but you have the mindset of like, now I'm going to have like I'll say a certificate on it. Does that mean something to you, or do you think that means something to your clients?
Neither. I think it's just about being always curious. I'm like always just curious about how other people are doing things, what might work better. I'm a firm believer in just continually coaching. And I think some of the things that we do the most, like our career and the things we love, we probably need coaching but don't. I can give you like an example. Like you mentioned, I'm a big snowboarder. It's a big part of my identity. I love it. It's taken me all over the world. Over the last couple of years, I've really struggled with my relationship with snowboarding. I'm not having fun. I feel like I suck. Things just aren't working well. Like it felt like a friend of mine had a good analogy. It was like driving with the brakes on, right? And I shared this with some very confidentially. It was very vulnerable. And I was like, as I shared it in my mind, I'm like, this is sort of I'm retiring. Not that anyone would care, right? But like, I'm retiring from snowboarding. I'm giving it up. And someone was just like, well, maybe you just need a coaching session, right? And then we went up, a couple coaching. I was like, right? Like, it just kind of like re-engaged, made me work on some things. And I think that's just a really good sort of metaphor and analogy for like in our career. Like, I'm always kind of trying to like fine-tune, polish, not get complacent. And now I think we're in the middle and about to be on this rocket ship of things are changing, right? We have AI and all this stuff happening, and it's like, you know, I don't believe we're going to be irrelevant, you know, and as I get older, that's the biggest thing that I struggle with is my own relevancy and being relevant. I want to be cool, right? But we have this real opportunity, and so, it's just.
But in some way, it does matter to you and the client, I think. For, you know, at least what I unpack in it, because you wouldn't be doing it if it wasn't important. But I do think it's your mindset is just an interesting one to me. Is again back to types. You want that some sort of like end cap on it, or even if it's a re-engagement tool, you know.
Yeah, maybe to clients, like everyone's a different kind of buyer, right?
Right. Yeah.
You have
totally.
like people that want to buy with numbers and certificates. You have emotive buyers that feel, and you kind of want to hit all bases, like when you're doing that. But I can't tell you the last time someone was like, "Oh, cool, man, you got a nice certificate. Here's the contract," right? Like it just doesn't.
Well, I think something like snowboarding is a funny one too. Skateboarding too. Like at some point, you get to this point that you're not doing it the way you used to. I had this like vivid moment once. I was like going up to some jump, and I was like super gonna throw 540 off this, and literally got in the air and was all, "No, you're not actually." And then I was on the chair, and I was just kind of like this. And one of my sons said to me, "Was like, what's up?" And I'm all, "Just because you once could doesn't mean you still can," you know. And like that's a. But then figuring out how to get back to it, and like this
but you
is still a
could?
fun part. Yeah, if I still could, I would.
Yeah,
but
it might take a little work,
yeah,
you know.
Anyway. All right, so those of you that I had an opportunity this week, Wednesday night, for those of you that weren't there, we did an awesome talk, and I'm stealing an idea from that because it was really fun. So this is game time. This is our icebreaker middle ground kind of thing.
Yeah. And Jay told me like he's never done this before. This is the first time, which always
why
gives,
wouldn't I? I'm not going to try this out on like.
Which always gives a guest like a lot of confidence.
Yeah. No. And I think these are going to be fun for you. So what I'm looking for is, they can be kind of out there answers, but they're going to be really simple. It's lightning round, okay? So here we go. Film or video?
Film.
Knew it. Skiing or snowboarding?
Snowboard.
Classic rock or cool jazz?
Classic rock.
Come on, really? Mm-hmm. Okay.
I grew up in Detroit.
True. Electric or diesel?
Electric.
Long, slow, short, fast?
Long, slow.
You said this one already. Camping or hoteling?
Four Seasons, man.
Home cooked or chef cooked?
Home cooked.
Nice. Worst beer?
Anything that Kevin Menzie drinks, which is usually like a double IPA of some sort.
Oh, really?
Or yeah.
I was telling this story the other night that I worked on a brand that the guy made only sours, and I don't like sours. And every time we'd be leaving, he'd be like, "You guys want to take some beer?" I'm like, "Oh, I rode a motorcycle. No, I'm good." But anyway.
Yeah.
Okay, last one. Guilty pleasure.
That changes from time to time. Right now, it's buying and trying running shoes, and like at mass, and then returning them.
Nice. So you get like a massive shipment and send them all back. Hey, I thought you were gonna say like mani-pedi or something. You know?
I do like a good mani-pedi. I got a 13-year-old daughter, Ruby, and we do a lot of pedis together, and she picks the color, which is usually quite bright. And but yeah.
Well, you did great. That was fun. All right, so I don't know for how many of you have ever seen the Stefan Sagmeister. I think if everyone knows who Stefan Sagmeister is, a graphic designer, Swiss-born, ran a famous studio. Now kind of is just on this lifelong, what do you call it? Not a vacation.
Sabbatical.
And he basically goes through this whole thing because storytelling is a word that gets really thrown around. And he basically gets on this podium and says, "You're not a storyteller. I don't care what your job is," because he remarked about the guy that built roller coasters. He said, "I'm not building roller coasters. I'm telling stories." And he said, "No, it's bullshit. You actually make roller coasters, and it's fun, and it's fine, and you should just be happy making roller coasters." But I do think you have a right to say you're a storyteller. We set that up. You had I was really excited because we actually talked about it on your podcast, which Marc used to do this podcast called, and it's the best name for a podcast ever, Baby Got Backstory. Was the best. It was so fun. And he gets kind of irate. And I do think it was really interesting when you started talking about your approach to brand building is truly storytelling, because you were applying these things that maybe go back to that storyboard on the wall that took a year in the Oliver Stone days, that you're like, there's a development to this. There's beginning, there's middle, there's end. And I loved it. Fill us in a little bit, like, you create these characters in it, and whether that's the products, and that there's heroes and villains and all the good things that make a story. It's just fascinating to me that you can apply it to that. But does every project fit that mold when you kind of go and start working with your clients, or do you try and do it?
Yeah,
on some scale?
I think it's just a natural way that I see it. When I talk about falling in love with that love letter, it's that story, right? It's like, what's the connection? What's the arc? Now, I've kind of chilled a little bit since we've had that conversation on the storytelling. Look, classic story, beginning, middle, and end. Hey, I came here to Caffeinated Mornings. I sat down with Jay. It was over. Right? It's a story. It's not a good story.
Right. This is your best story today.
Right. It's not one that's going to draw you in. It's not one that's going to work or connect. But you could argue, and you'd be wrong if you argued it. It is a story,
right.
But it's not a good story. And so, really thinking about back to the roller coaster, like when I was in Iceland, I went on this. It's called Fly Over Iceland, and it essentially is like a video. You sit in it. It's kind of a rollery, coastery thing, but they had like a whole story as you came in. They told the story of Iceland and trolls and elves, and so there was like that was kind of like, it made me think of that, right? Like I was like, oh, well, this is a story. It's an immersive experience we're going through, and we're doing it. When approaching it with brands, yeah, I mean, it's always that, like, what's the arc, what's the transformation, what's interesting about this. A lot of times, when we do it from a brand standpoint, brand steps back a little bit and becomes more of like the mentor in a traditional story hero's journey structure, but always approach it with that in mind, and how can we tell that? But back to story being this like non-monogamous word, I think where people also really get confused, they're like, well, what's my story? And if anyone asks you that, what do you say? Like, you don't have one story, right? You're like made up of like thousands of them. I think the trick is choosing which one to tell, right? And that's always really interesting for me when I work with a brand. Really, what I'm always, it's not up there anymore, what I'm always working towards is this like manifesto of sorts, which is a narrative alliteration of all the things we go through in the brand process, right? Like, what's that brand DNA? What makes you different? What are your values? What's your purpose? What's the differentiator? What's your position in the marketplace? Like, who are you trying to appeal to? And then just try to tell that in story form. That is a manifesto. That's what I call a brand story. Some people might call that. That's also like, people have different definitions for that. But that's also not like, if we're like talking about individual as a brand, that's not your origin story. That's not your maybe transformation story. So we have all these stories, and it's really about choosing which one at the right time. They all kind of follow that same framework. And then to kind of bring it back to your question, yeah, for me, I go through that process. It's all in service. Like my big, because I love to write and I love the narrative, my big ta-da moment, right, is always that manifesto. So it's like, 60 pages of slides you sit through at the end of your engagement for me to read you a page and a half manifesto that incorporates all that. And that's the trick. That's the thing, right? And I think anyone here that's in the creative space in any regard understands that, like, being simple, distilling is like one of the hardest things, and that's the magic. And and sometimes the best compliment, even though it's like annoying, is like when someone's like, I could have done that, or that's so simple. Like, you're like, like, that's like sweet, right?
Well, and, the thing I think that it illustrates though is that that is your process in getting there. And the thing that I think I had this aha moment when I used to detest the word process. And I was kind of like that guy that I'd be like, no, I don't have a process, man. It's like every time it's different, blah, blah, blah. But then I started to see it as I think it's beat into our heads that process is the same set of steps on the same recurring time schedule. So and to me, what I realized at one point was, oh, dude, you do have a process, so you're not as cool as you thought you were, because I thought it would be cool to be edgy and not have a process. But then I realized it's more like an accordion. And in sometimes in the span of even let's say you have a day to do something, you're probably going to run through the whole story building thing that you have to do, right? And I even every once in a while, I'll be like, even if it's not in, something like if a client doesn't have a positioning statement, a lot of times I'll end up writing it, whether I show it to them or not, because I need the anchor point to be like, Do you ever find yourself doing that with a manifesto that you back pocketed, even if it wasn't a part of a deliverable or something? To me, that's the art. It's the super beautiful, fun. It's the emotional, Bible takeaway, if you will. But is that always a deliverable for you?
These days, usually, but not always. And the thing is, you'd think it would be super linear, but it's not. A lot of times, when I'm stuck on a position or don't know where to go, I just start writing a manifesto, because it's what came up and what am I feeling, and that's where it becomes. And then all of a sudden, this is kind of what's resonating. This is cool. Then I start to backtrack and make all the history and the work and the data kind of backfill and work. Yeah. But that's how I do it. But to your point, I was the same way. I never had a process for a long time, and I was just
well, I mean, maybe you did, but maybe you just didn't know how to define it or
I didn't think I did, which made me a little bit mental, a little crazy, because even with the process, I think it's hard enough, right, to work through the process. So,
well, and I always joke, I love that drawing of there's the timeline of most creative projects. It's there's all the time wasted, and then there was this little teeny slot of all the crying when the work gets done. That sometimes that's what it feels like, right? We live in this process. But now what I try and do when I'm in those phases, I will look, I'm where are you in this process right now? Even if you're not super cognizant of it, because sometimes that's an anchoring component. Dude, you're still in discovery. Maybe just fucking give yourself a break for a minute. That's what I have to literally, that's why no one works in my studio, by the way. Because it is like that. There's usually loud music and then me talking to myself. But it is a fascinating thing when I think about how you arrive at that, using that story construct. It can be really big sometimes, Warren Remembrance level big, right? 60 pages. I've even seen some of your decks, and I'm like, Mark, where am I getting to the thing that I'm supposed to, illustrate?
There's one slide at the end, always,
exactly,
right?
Yeah.
But and it's all these components, and just the way you tell a story. It's what's the character? What's the world? What are we trying to tell? What's the transformation? What's our promise, right? What's going to happen? And that's all that whole going through that process, just getting those building blocks,
right?
And then putting them together and assembling them.
All right. So, if there was one thing you knew when you got started that you know now, what would it be? What would you tell yourself? What would you tell a young Mark? Hey, man, you're running film around on a lot. Don't go into that cottage. What would it be?
Oh, there's so many things. The thing that kind of comes to mind, when I started my first business, I went to my father-in-law, who's a very successful entrepreneur. His name's Kimball. And I said, Kimball, I'm going to start my business. Tell me what I need to know. And he was just like, it's really hard. And he walked away. And I was like, I was like, I wanted to know more. Yeah, I wanted the gold. I wanted the secret. I wanted to know. And having gone through it, he was right. That was the secret. It's really, really hard. And so knowing that, accepting that it's I don't know about you, but I always had this, I look at other people, that seems really easy. It seems like they just kind of did this thing, they raised a bunch of money, they sold it, they're rich, they're happy, I want that, But
someone just give me that.
Yeah, just give me that. But the reality is that's just really hard, and it's always hard. And hard isn't a negative word, right? It's just to have the grit and to keep moving. And I always thought at some point in my life I'd just be coasting, and I'd be I don't know, maybe the adults I always saw, hey, you have it figured out, you just kind of going to work every day and you just kind of do your thing. And that hasn't been my experience. It's just always been a bit of it's just been difficult. And so to accept that and embrace that, and that's what
But I think a lot of the things that you do, snowboarding's not easy. Running marathons isn't easy. So you do engage in things that you probably walk up to knowing, but sometimes it's hard to realize that with what we do as a career, right?
Yeah.
You're I love this thing, but man, sometimes it's fucking hard, and you probably do hate it sometimes, right?
Yeah, and I don't know. If you talk to my therapist, it's probably about this like never-ending quest to either feel alive or to feel, to feel younger or to keep proving something to myself or my parents or whatever, right? But there is something there, and yeah, I love the challenge. I love looking at something and saying, can I do that, and then seeing if I can, right?
Yeah. Well, you're awesome. I really
thank you. This
has
been great.
This is super rad, dude. Anyway, thank you for being here.
Thank
you guys all
Thank
for
you,
being
everybody.
here.
Thank you for spending the time.
So this is a First Friday event. Every first Friday, if you're around and you have time, come visit us. We'll be here. Next month is Lindsay Hagen from Gnarly Bay, production studio here, makes some really awesome films. So join us back for her and her crew, and we hope to see you soon. Thanks so much for being out here, everybody.
Thank you.
Dude.